Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the inaugural webinar of the National Economics Association to kick off 100 years of Black economics. My name is Rhonda Sharpe. I am the president of the Women's Institute for Science, Equity, and Race. I am also the co-editor of the Review of Black Political Economy and the past president of the National Economics Association. I am super excited to have my travel partner, my co-author, the woman that I go to when I have questions about feminist economics, Nina Books, who is an associate professor of economics at Bucknell University. She is also the inaugural director of Bucknell's Ghana Study Abroad program. She co-founded the Africana Studies program with Carmen Gillespie, also at Bucknell. And this morning, Nina is going to be talking to us about reclaiming a really important economist that we've been hearing so much about, Sadie Alexander. So I'd like to welcome you all for joining us. And good morning, Nina.
Good morning. Can you hear me all right?
I hear you just fine. So let's, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I wanted to thank you. Rhonda is, as she said, a traveling buddy and also a very valued friend, and the founder and president of Wiser Policy. So I'd like to thank Wiser Policy for co-hosting this important event with the National Economic Association, and also to thank Robert Johnson for doing organizational work. He's a graduate student at University of Missouri, Kansas City, and of course our NEA president, Linwood Tahi. So thank you and welcome to those of you who are joining us today.
Okay. So Nina, I want to start this conversation by having you tell us a little bit about who Dr. Sadie Alexander is, and how most of us know of her through your work, but if you would tell us a little bit about who she is and how you learned about her.
Sure, and I have some slides, and let me just say that typically that I'm not going to give a speech. I gave a speech on Sadie Alexander 2 weeks ago. The University of Pennsylvania had an amazing conference, a one-day conference in honor of the 100th anniversary of when Sadie Alexander received her doctorate degree, which will be June of 2021. So they had an event to commemorate that, to honor that. And the event focused on the very important topic of race and economics. So I gave about a 25-minute speech 2 weeks ago. I'm not going to give a speech on Sadie Alexander today. If you are interested in hearing the speech, there are lots of little podcasts and videos online that I've given, but I would also direct you to the Penn Talk, which is now online. So this is not scripted, is what I'm going to say. And Rhonda knows from
recording has started.
Rhonda knows from our traveling together that I'm usually scripted. So this is going to be off the cuff. And I'm going to start by showing you some pictures. I hope. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Oh, wonderful. Okay, so your question was, who is Sadie Alexander and how did I become interested in Sadie Alexander? So this is a quote that I think is...
Nina, can you put it in? Can you put the PowerPoint? Yeah.
How's that?
Perfect.
So this is a quote, and this is a quote that's in the book that will be out next summer. That it's a book of Sadie Alexander speeches and writings. And I think that this is a really important quote because it goes to so much of what Sadie Alexander discussed throughout her life. The American Negroes are not beggars for privileges, but rather we are leaven in the bread of American way of life, prickers of the conscience of the people, sentinels of justice. And she said that in 1947 within a speech. So Sadie Alexander was born in 1898 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, born into prominent, highly accomplished African-American families. The Tanners, some of you may be familiar with Bishop Tanner of the AME Church. That was her grandfather. And so there's the Tanners on one side and the Mossells on the other. And I talked about this extensively in 2 weeks, but a quick summary: she attended the M Street School in Washington, D.C. She lived between Philadelphia and D.C., but went to high school in D.C. and attended the M Street School, and she benefited from the ideas of Carter Woodson. She ended up going to the University of Pennsylvania. Her mother wanted her to attend Penn. She wanted to attend Howard. So she attended the University of Pennsylvania as an undergraduate. And eventually she got a doctorate degree in 1921 from the University of Pennsylvania, and her doctorate degree was in economics. She had difficulty finding a job within this field, 1921. And that year is also significant because it was the year where the first African-American women in our history received their doctorate degrees. And so she was one of 3 African-American women, 1921, who received the doctorate degree. But no one hired any of these women in a position that was commensurate with their levels of education in 1921. So Sadie Alexander then ends up she works for a while in North Carolina as an assistant actuary and gets married in 1923, moves back to Philadelphia and gets married to Raymond Pace Alexander, and then embarks on a career in law. And she had a very significant career as a lawyer, and she died in 1989. And so I had never heard about Sadie Alexander as a graduate student until a friend of mine who was a history graduate student in the history department at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, one day introduced me to this, volume. It was 2 volumes at that time. I believe it's 3 now, Black Women in America. And there was an entry on Sadie Alexander, and I was shocked because it said that she was the first African-American woman to get a doctorate degree in economics. But had never heard of her in any of my econ classes. And then a few years later, I was still a graduate student, and I was doing research, but I was also teaching a job at the time in order to make ends meet. And I was co-teaching a course on African-American feminist thought. And there was an article within the anthology by Sadie Alexander, and I put it up here, a copy of it, Negro Women in Our Economic Life, which appeared originally in Opportunity magazine from the National Urban League, and it appeared in 1930. And I read it, and I was really struck by the ideas that she expressed in 1930. And so when I read it then, what really stood out for me is that she was talking about the process of the transformation of women's work from working within the household, and that work being recognized as an important contribution to the family economy, to the devaluation of women's household work, and it, as the market grew in capitalist systems, to that work being viewed primarily as consumption rather than as work. And so for me, it was striking because that's what feminist economists were talking about when I was in graduate school. And so clearly she was thinking about issues that other economists were thinking about. She was thinking about those issues at an earlier point in time. When I go back and reread Negro Women in Our Economic Life today, what's also striking about this article, and this is, she wasn't publishing in economic journals, but she's publishing in a magazine that is widely accessible to African Americans. So what is significant to me about this piece in 1930 is that she is putting forth an argument that says that black women's employment is important, it's necessary to the economy and to black women's advancement, right? This is still the era of notions of racial uplift. But she's saying that at a point in time when a point in time in our history where it was expected that married women would not be participating in paid labor. But we know that African American women had to participate in paid labor because of discrimination against black men. Their earnings were not sufficient to be able to support their wives as homemakers. As white men, their earnings were higher, and so they were able to do that. So black women faced a double bind, right? They were ridiculed as being unfit mothers, who were neglecting their children, and so black children were viewed as being delinquent, in part because their mothers were involved in paid labor, so they're being viewed as problem wives and mothers. But at the same time, black women who wanted to be able to stay at home, as white women were doing, and working as homemakers for their families, black women were ridiculed as being lazy. So they faced a double bind. So when I think about this article today, those are the kinds of things that I think about. Okay, so I read that, and that was probably about 20 years ago or so, late 1990s, Negro Women in Our Economic Life. I defended my dissertation. I found another job, and I had a junior leave. And so by that time, I had also read a really important article by Julianne Malveaux called Missed Opportunity. And I have it up on the screen. And so one of the things that I said 2 weeks ago is that prior to Malveaux's article and her research on Sadie Alexander was literally a footnote in economic analysis. And when I say footnote, I'm talking about economists who were writing about other economists, such as Abram Harris Jr. So Sandy has done seminal research on Abram Harris Jr. So economists who were writing about some of our other early economists and economic thinkers would note that Sadie Alexander was the first African-American economist. So that was known until it was no longer known. And something happened that Sadie Alexander was no longer recognized as the first African-American economist. So by the time I started doing research, I knew that she was the first African-American woman economist, but I actually wasn't aware that she was the first African-American economist. So I read this piece by Malveaux, which is...
Let me jump in here for a minute and ask you to back up on that. So do you see there is a significance in terms of her not just being the first African-American woman, but the first period, right? Is there some significance in there that you think is important as we're moving into this 100-year celebration? Like, is there something significant about that?
I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure how I would want to answer that, right? But I guess what I would say is that, because it wasn't deliberate, right, on the part of economists. No, people weren't black economists weren't trying to erase, the history of Sadie Alexander. She was forgotten, right? And I think that is what is significant, is that she was forgotten. So to me, that speaks to an issue of the invisibility of African-American women's work, perhaps. And I don't know how it came to be downplayed or forgotten, but it happened. And so, I mean, as recently as 2 years ago, when I went through the review process for my book proposal at Yale University Press, one of the things that I had to justify was my claim that Sadie Alexander was the first African-American economist, right? And I can come back to that, right? But to go back to Malveau's piece, which is really, I think, important for a number of reasons, right? So Julianne Malveau is the economist who is responsible for bringing Sadie Alexander to the scholarly attention of the economics profession with this really important piece that appeared in the American Economic Review in 1991. And so based on her research on Sadie Alexander and recovery work, right? That's the beginning of this recovery process. And so she evaluated Sadie Alexander's dissertation and talked about the missed opportunity of having her as someone who was actively engaged in the economic profession. So after Sadie Alexander became a lawyer, after she faced discrimination, systemic discrimination, wasn't able to get hired as an economist and became a lawyer, Malveau says that Sadie Alexander no longer had an engagement with the economics profession. And that's true. She didn't have an engagement anymore with the economics profession. One of the things that Julianne Malveau noted in this piece is that it seemed that Sadie Alexander had perhaps a passing interest in economics, and that was about it. And so as a feminist economist, I kept thinking, what if I go to the archives at Penn and dig around and see if I can find that Sadie Alexander continued to have some interest in economics, right? Because the prevailing thinking at that time was that she had no more interest in economics after she became a lawyer. And as a feminist economist, this is important because there were other feminist economists who were doing this for early women economists, right? Because of we have a field that celebrates the accomplishments of men economists, and if you look at most of the volumes on our early economists, those volumes focus on men, don't include women or many women. And so feminist economists have been trying to recover this history. There are African-American economists who've also recovered this history. And again, Jim Stewart, I would put in that category, as well as Sandy Darity, are two economists who've done that. And there are others who are doing it as well. But we didn't have it for an African-American woman economist. And so for me, Malveau's missed opportunity seemed like a challenge. Could I go to the archives and find some sense that Sadie Alexander had continued to have her interest in economics?
So thank you for that, and I can say I can remember when I was at Bucknell, and I don't remember your male student, but I would see him in the common area, and he would be, I think, Xeroxing or doing something with papers that you would bring back from the archives, and also just having conversations about you figuring out how to spend time and taking Emiliano and Julian with you, right? So remember those conversations of you going to the archives. And so I think that's really a really important note, right? Talking about this recovery process and spending time in the archives, because I feel like there's a generation of economists who are coming through, and so much of what we see happening in the profession right now is very quantitative. And that I often think that there are folks who have an interest in economic history, right? Whether it's feminist or there was a conversation yesterday with Warren Watley, and he was talking about, thinking about the slave trade. My own work with Sandy Darity and Greg Price, looking at sterilization in North Carolina. So I've spent a minute in the archives. It's not my idea of a good time. I think I'd rather clean data than in the archives, right? But can you talk a little bit more about that? Because I could imagine that there's a generation. Part of what we have the ability to do in this conversation is not just to talk about Dr. Alexander, but also talk about the process and open a new methodology or put it on the radar of some young scholars who might be interested in doing recovery work, even if it's not about an economist, Black or otherwise, but just thinking the conversation about reparations. What's the value of thinking about the slave trade? I can imagine that a lot of that would require spending time in archives. So can you talk a little bit about what that process was like, sort of not in the weeds, but in terms of like getting permission, what were the things you had to be mindful of? What were some of the frustrations, and then, you know, some of the high points of that?
Okay, so I've got some pictures, right? So here's the thing. When I went to the archives, I started doing this research in 2003, so it was a long time ago. I went during my junior leave, and I started. I mean, the collection for Sadie Alexander is extraordinary. 2 years before she died, the Alexander family donated their papers, their records, to the University of Pennsylvania for several family members. It is an extraordinary collection, and this is a tremendous gift to the nation from the Alexander family, because these files are really important in understanding African American history, understanding institutions such as the National Urban League or the National Bar Association, and understanding things about our culture. So an amazing collection. And I guess before I want to talk about the archives, what I want to say is that I already had that background. So you're absolutely right that it is not very common today to use archival research, because we are a discipline that is oriented around quantitative research. When I did my dissertation, very few economists were doing archival research. Today, there are some who are going in and they are finding data or maps, and they are digitizing information from archives. My research was different from that, because it was all qualitative, and it was a deep dive into the files, doing extensive research. Now, in terms of the speeches, right?
Nina, let me get you to go back for a second. So you said that your research is different, that for others it's about collecting data, it is getting maps, and yours was qualitative. Tell us a little bit about, so that we're clear in terms of how you're separating that. What does that mean when you say your work was qualitative? Like,
what I'm saying is that okay, so this is very a deep immersion within the files. So I started. Let me tell you the story. So I started in 2003, and when I went, I found 2 boxes that contained speeches, and when I read through the speeches, what I realized is, the speeches are focused on African Americans, but that they had economic content. They were about the economic status of African Americans. They're focused on economic policies that have an impact on African Americans. And, it's interesting because she was directing these speeches primarily to African American audiences. They're not, so she ends up, my argument has been since that time is that Sadie Alexander found a way to continue to practice economics. Mm-hmm. And so when I read the speeches, it was clear to me that she continued to have an interest in economics. But I knew, having done archival research, that I needed to continue to dig through the archives so that I would be able to contextualize her speeches, right? And so, and again, I think that I was ideally suited to do this, not only because I had a background in doing archival research, but because, like Sadie Alexander, I had also written a dissertation on African American migrants to a city in Pennsylvania. Her dissertation focused on the migration of African Americans to Philadelphia. My dissertation focused on the migration of African Americans to Pittsburgh, both during the early migration period. And so I already had that context, the knowledge of that particular process and why it was significant. I'm also a native Pennsylvanian. I have an interdisciplinary background. Hers was in economics, sociology, and history. Mine was in economics, sociology, and history, right? And then bringing my feminist lens to it was also helpful in, I think, enabling me to kind of sort through the files to figure out what is significant and what is interesting. That's an important process or part of doing archival research, is having an extensive interdisciplinary background, so that when the researcher goes through these files, they are able to make sense of them and to recognize what is important and who is important. Got some pictures here of archival boxes so that people understand. So you asked about the rules. Archives have very strict rules of engagement because the materials are old and they are valuable. This looks like this is the size of the archival boxes at Penn, and each box contains file folders. And so going through the boxes requires a tremendous amount of attention to detail, meticulous note-taking. So I have, I think almost 200 pages of just notes, thousands of pages of materials that I copied, because whenever I went, I was always on a race against time. And so it means recording the box number, the file number, and then a description of every single entry that I decided, was important to record. A description such as letter from Jane Doe to Sadie Alexander, March 15th, 1930, right? And then a description of it. And if I thought it was very important and I didn't write down a lot of notes, I would then copy it. And so you're talking about Darby Hamilton, who was my first research assistant. So in those days, what I would do is take pictures and send them to myself. But let me go back before I talk about that process and just say that, part of it, so there are lots of challenges. The documents are old, they're fragile, and so they have to be handled very carefully. The archives have, hours that for me were not very accessible. I live 3 hours away from Philadelphia. As you know, I'm a slow driver, so that 3 hours might really be 3.5 hours one way. So the archives are open from 9:30 until 4:30. And when I started this as a junior professor, I had a baby on the way and a toddler. And then my marriage ended and I became a lone parent. And so it became impossible for me to be able to get children to daycare, because the archives are only open during the week, 9:30 to 4:30, to get children to daycare or school by whatever time it opened, and then to get back in time, right? And so I did do that. There were some days whenever I, managed to go there and have about 2 hours, right, and spend 6 to 7 or 8 hours on the road that one day in order to do that. But that proved to be really difficult. So I have a gap of about 10 years where I could not go to the archives and do research because of the issues of being a lone parent. We're hearing all this information today now because of the COVID about the problems that women who are in careers, demanding careers, have with balancing their work and childcare. So think about that from the standpoint of someone who is a lone parent, so one set of hands at home and one income, okay? So a 10-year gap, and during that 10-year gap, of course, I continued to give speeches and publish on her, but I couldn't get to Philadelphia in order to do the archival research. I applied for external grants, couldn't get any, and again, that's, I think, tied to the devaluation of qualitative research in economics. It's just not typical, and I'm not a historian, so I couldn't get research from those funding sources. Finally, in, I think it was 2014, I had two colleagues, Jan Knadler and Amy Wolver, who were the directors of Bucknell Institute for Public Policy. They provided me with a grant so that I could go and do research during the summer. My kids were old enough at that time. My oldest son was 14. And so we could go. I could take them, and we stayed in an extended stay hotel in the Philadelphia area. And I would leave them at the hotel, a 14-year-old and a 10-year-old. The 10-year-old is very, very sharp and very mature, and the 14-year-old was big, right? So I knew that they were going to be safe. And so I'd leave them at the hotel. The hotel had the pool and, basketball court, but they spent their days, playing Xbox. And then I would go to the archives and I would do this work. It is not, it is tedious, as you said, but it was never boring for me. I never had one moment of being bored, because for me it made history come alive. It was exciting to learn about her life, and to also read about other African American luminaries. I held letters signed by A. Philip Randolph, for example. Or to look at the correspondence that she had with Thurgood Marshall, or Charles Hamilton Houston, right? So all of that was just really, really exciting. Okay, so I started to go back, right, with this idea of reclaiming her. 2003, I start the research. By 2005, I have enough information that I'm, convinced that Sadie Alexander continued to have an interest in economics. And later what I end up finding out is that she always thought of herself. Digging deep, I realized that she continued to think about herself as an economist. So this was the first public talk that I gave, and I put this up here. It was 2005. It was at Bucknell. And at the bottom, again, I refer to her as African-American, the first African-American woman economist. And at the bottom that I'm going to compare her publications to early black male economists, George Haynes and Abram Harris Jr., because that was the thinking at the time. At the time, somehow, we were thinking that George Haynes was the first African-American economist.
So Nina, let me chime in here, because that's an important comment that you said. We kept thinking that George or Abraham were the first economists. And I've had this conversation on Twitter, and it's one of the questions that's come across. And that is, do you think part of this is how we define what's an economist, right? And so this notion that because she wasn't what we think about as practicing economist, she wasn't an economist, and not so much. And because people didn't know who she was, they didn't have access to her speeches. They couldn't see, and thank you for sharing an edition of the book so that I could read that and see how economics is woven into that. But do you think that that's also part of it, is how we define an economist?
I think that's an excellent point, right? And how we define an economist, I think, has shifted over time. So if I think about, I just gave a lecture the other day on Thorsten Veblen, who had a doctorate degree in philosophy. There are a number of early people that we regard as economists who did not have doctorate degrees in economics, but they worked at universities as economists. So George Edmund Haynes referred to himself as a social economist, and he did really important work on black migrants. And so he worked in economic spaces, and probably, I don't know, maybe I think it was probably that first summer, 2014. My kids and I would go every summer and do research at the archive. I would do the research in the archives, and they were with me in Philly. And so at some point when I was digging around the archives, there was something that I read about Haynes in the context of the National Urban League that made me question whether or not he actually had a doctorate degree in economics. And so I started then doing research on him, and what I found is that his doctorate degree was in a sociology field. You're absolutely right. And so he did do economic analysis, and he called himself a social economist, but his degree was not in economics. Her degree was in economics, and so she really is the first African-American economist. And again, this was known. I see it, when I look at the writings of Jim Stewart and Sandy Darity. There are notes, and they're talking about people, so it was known. And I don't know how it happened that this narrative was advanced, that George Edmund Haynes was the first economist. But it was out there, and I believed it until I started doing research and realized, no, it wasn't the case. So what is an economist? I think of an economist, right, as somebody today who has a doctorate degree in economics or a doctorate degree in a closely related field whose, I think, doctoral research deals extensively with economic issues, and they work as an economist. That's, I think, how I would define an economist.
And Twitter said no to that. Twitter was like, which I wanted to just choke Twitter, but Twitter was like, no, that's not the definition of an economist. And people came back and they said, well, it really depends on the space, in European space. If you are and I think some of this also applies in the U.S., that if you're in a policy space, you don't necessarily have to have a PhD in economics to be an economist. And I think someone even replied that there are economists at the UN who have bachelor's degrees. But if you are doing, I think what people think of more as academic research, then the thought is if you're in that space, then you do need to have a PhD in economics. So I'm sorry to interrupt, what you were talking about in terms of placing her, but that was a question from a student, I believe, at Howard Marcel was asking that. And I think it's so important because it ties directly to why we don't think of her as an economist, and why she, I think, hasn't been in these conversations and more as a footnote, right, and not a direct part of the conversation around economics, because even though she had a PhD, she didn't work as an economist.
Well, okay, and so a couple of things. One is that I never would have called myself an economist until I had that doctorate degree in economics. When I was a graduate student working, doing research, when I was an undergraduate as an economics major, I would not have called myself, when I graduated, an economist. I didn't call myself an economist until I had that PhD. Sadie Alexander, and this is the argument that I want to make, right? Sadie Alexander was always an economist. And I talk about this in the book, because I sent you a copy of it. Sadie Alexander was always an economist. She had a doctorate degree in economics. She continued to think of herself as an economist, and she continued to do work as an economist. And there's evidence of that not only in her speeches, but also in the testimonies that she gave, the work that she gave. And so when I think about her as an economist, I think of her as a non-academic economist. Yeah, I think that there is a bias when we think about economists as people who are in academic spaces, and she was not. She was a non-academic economist. Right. So I worked on dispelling that assumption that Haynes was the first. And then just quickly, 2006, these are my first ASSA presentations on Sadie Alexander. And so the first one, I was ambitious as an assistant professor. I would never do this again, is write 2 speeches for a conference, but this is a one that I organized with Jean Shackelford, who was a colleague at Bucknell. And this is an IRFE panel that focused on the black worker and early black economic thought, and I turned that into a journal article. So that's something for young people to be thinking about. And you can see I have C.C. Conrad as a discussant, Sandy Darity, There's Jim Stewart, right? That was a really good panel. And then the other one, and I hope do you remember? I have a picture on the other side of the booklet at the time. Do you remember that cover? Anyway, the second panel was a panel by the NEA, organized by Quabena, which meant that he would have been the president-elect, and it focused on skin tone and economic outcomes, historical evidence. I was put on this panel very junior with these senior people, and my topic had nothing to do with skin tone and economic outcomes, and yet people, economists, members of the NEA, were really interested in hearing about Sadie Alexander. And you'll note the topic, Unpacking Sadie, Creating Her Own Pathways to Practicing Economics. Right, so I have been arguing for a long time that Sadie Alexander found a way to continue to function as an economist. Just as an aside, you'll see that not only was Greg Price a panelist, but he was also a discussant. So afterwards, Quabena came up to me and told me, congratulated me on the piece and said he was, he was glad that he put me on that panel. Greg came up to me, and the first thing that he said to me was, and he frowned at me and he said, "Why didn't you cite Julianne Malveaux?"
That's true fashion Greg, right? That
exactly.
That is his thing. You have got to cite a black economist, right? That if we're not citing each other, that it has implications in terms of our whole career trajectory.
Absolutely.
It is, but we forget, right?
But here's the thing. I did cite her in the paper. I didn't cite her whenever I was talking, but you know what? That was an important lesson. And so now, of course, I always cite her in the papers, but I think it's also, he's right. It's important to also say it as well. So I thought that was a cute anecdote, because that, as you said, is Greg.
It is. And it is also one of the things I think that we forget when we're speaking, that a lot of times your audience may never read your articles, right? And so that it is important for us to talk about the people who have, at least, as again, I know that you're on Twitter, and so you see a lot of the things that go on in econ Twitter, but a while back there was a conversation about someone not citing Terry Ann Craigie, who is no longer a junior economist, and I was pleasantly surprised to see, I think it was Leah, and I'm not going to butcher her last name, and I forget if she's still at Princeton or if she's at UCLA, and she made the comment that her practice is to cite written any article that has influenced her work. And I do think, or that particular paper, I think that we forget that, right? So it's important and written, and it's important to say it in the audience. And I would argue that it's probably more important when it's an NEA event, to make sure that we are acknowledging NEA members and scholars who have an affiliation or some influence on the work that we're doing. And
that's, again, the story of Sadie Alexander, the invisibility of our work, right? And so she was overlooked during her lifetime because of discrimination based on race, based on gender, but that's also true of black economists today, is that non-black economists often overlook the critical work of African Americans, right, African-American economists. I want to go through these really quickly because I know we're getting now pressed for time, right? We've got about a half an hour left. Okay, so just so people can have a sense of these speeches. So the speeches are amazing, and one of the difficulties with the speeches is that Sadie Alexander's handwriting was horrible. Very, 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 very difficult to decipher. So you can see that the early speeches, many of her early speeches were handwritten. Some of the later speeches were typed. You can see from this picture that, and this is a copy of a speech, is that the edges were frayed because the paper is old and it's delicate. But this is an example of a speech on legal head paper this is an insert, and this is very common, that she would have inserts and strikeouts and arrows in different directions. And even on her typed speeches, she would, insert with her handwriting between the typed areas. And then, as you see on here, she would not only have arrows and all, but also writing along the margins. And so this is my research assistant, Lily Shorney, and I have been working on these speeches for the past 2 years, deciphering them and putting them together into this volume that's going to come out next summer. But so this is an example, and what I would do, I don't know what Lily did, and Lily's young eyes were able to decipher a lot of the early speeches. What I had to do is use a magnifying glass, or I would enlarge the speech. And so on the one side you see there's a part that I never figured out, and I wrote the little W question mark, and so I would have a key, her little squiggles, and what I thought this would mean, and some of the words I never figured out. Most we were able to figure out, but it was a painstaking process of trying to decipher her handwriting. Adam Smith, right? You can't really see it, but there are two pieces, there are two words that are circled where Sadie Alexander made a reference to Adam Smith, and Lily and I couldn't figure out what those words were, what those letters were. And so after, 2 years of trying to decipher this stuff, about a week before my edits were due, I asked Lily to find some Adam Smith experts for me. She found 3. I sent them an email with the typed area with the pink is the email that I sent them, and I explained the project and asked them if they could decipher what this was. And this is the circle part, those are the words, and then my interpretation of it. And I tell you, within 5 minutes, one of the experts, the Adam Smith expert, wrote back and he figured it out. He said it's higgling and bargaining of the market. And the other 2 also wrote back, within a short period of time. But it took us, those words don't look like higgling and bargaining, right? So deciphering her handwriting was a struggle. Bucknell financed my research. Really important, because this was a really expensive undertaking, going to Philadelphia during summers and living there in order to spend days and weeks at the archives. I would not have been able to do it had it not been for Bucknell University. I received, in addition to the BIP grant, Dean's Fellowship grant, and that enabled me to be able to do this research. So thank you, Bucknell University. But I also want to thank, over the years, I've had a lot of students who helped me try to decipher her handwriting. Darby, right there, the student with the beard, was my first research assistant, and some of the others were also helpful in trying to, interpret the speeches. Ty, who's with the hat, and Mark Small was instrumental in helping me with the speech that I gave. So they were wonderful. And then finally, my last slide. So Darby was the first research assistant, and then Jingi Zhu and Lily Shorney and Soni Mednani were research assistants as well. Soni is at the archive. Soni is the student with the black hair, and she worked with me summer of 2019 at the archives. She received a grant to do that, and so she went there with me, and I taught her how to do archival research, and she was invaluable. Her research assistance is primarily for the biography that I'm writing on Sadie Alexander. So what came out of all of this is that I realized that Sadie Alexander was so important that I had to write not just a book of her speeches, an edited volume of her speeches, but also a biography of her life. And so Soni is the main researcher on that project. And then Lily Shorney is the main research assistant who has worked on the volume of speeches. She sent me this picture the other day, and I chose this picture because she kind of has like a little smirk on her face, and this is the typical look that I would see from working with a professor who is fairly absent-minded. So that's the end of of my slides.
So I'm glad that you ended with Lily, because I do want to talk a little bit about the speeches, and want to make sure that you give us the title of the book, and also I want to put this webinar in context. So, we were talking about what to do in terms of celebrating 100 years, but also that this weekend is significant, right? I do believe Monday, maybe? Monday, I think, marks the 31st anniversary of her death. I mean, she died like November 2nd, something like that, 1989. So we're thinking about when would be how to kick this off. So I want to make sure first, give us the title of the book before we start talking about the speeches. We've got about 9 minutes to do that before I want to open it up for questions. So give us the title of the speech book.
The title of the book, and this is with Yale University Press, it's an edited volume. Sadie Alexander is the author. And the title of the book is Democracy, Race, and Justice, Select Speeches and Writings of Sadie T. Alexander. And that is going to come out, we are aiming for June 15th, 2021, because that is 100 years to the day of when Sadie Alexander defended her dissertation. And so for me, it's a way of really just bringing her back into the canon of economic thought 100 years after this remarkable woman. And she was brilliant. As people will see when they read through the speeches, the speeches are truly remarkable. The speeches focus on so many of the same issues that African-American economists have been talking about over the span of 100 years, and she was the first. They're very eloquent, and as I read through them, they speak to me at different moments depending on what's happening in our history. And right now, the speeches that especially resonate with me are the speeches that focus on urban unrest, urban rebellions against racial injustice, or the focus on police brutality, over-policing, and criminalization of black behavior. So her speeches were truly remarkable and very much in sync with the intellectual thought of African-American economists who have come since her.
You and I have had this conversation because when I was reading, I think it was the one that you actually put up, Negro Women in Our Economic Life. I just remember what really struck me was that one in particular hit me hard, because it was seeing her talk about Maggie Walker, but then also talking about black women in hygiene. And I remember her saying to you, like, what in the world, Nina? And your response to me was like, this was common for elite black women of this time. But I also was struck by, as I was going through, and I was thinking, oh, wow, there's this conversation about low-skilled black workers, which is very much connected to the conversation that we're having now around automation. There was this enumeration of where black women were working, and I was like, wow, here's the early beginnings of thinking about occupation segregation, right? There was, I'm trying to think what else, because I wrote some notes to myself, listening to her. I think it was a dinner party where someone asked her if she was still a Republican, right? And then hearing her talk about how what Democrats were particularly doing in the North. And I was like, that was moot, right? Because most of the problems were in the South, right? It was the South that was creating so many problems. So those were some of what I read that stuck out to me. But was there a particular speech that resonates with you?
Thanks. Okay, so to go back to the hygiene point, and again, this is where context matters, right, and that historical knowledge, because the dissertation that I wrote focused on African American women who were social workers and who were providing services to African American women who were migrants from the South into the North, into Pittsburgh. And the Urban League was very much focused on the issue of cleanliness, right? Cleanliness as a gateway to respectability. So if we think about that speech that you're talking about, right, and I don't remember which one it was in particular, but this, that reference to hygiene, that was very common for middle-class black women to talk about issues of hygiene, in the early part of the 20th century. So that didn't throw me off because I knew that was very common. What I will say is that I think that there is a perception of elitism when it comes to Sadie Alexander, and that is not something that is prevalent throughout her economic writings. She really spoke about, most of her speeches focused on African American working class, and in a very sympathetic light. Is there a speech that really resonates with me? I would say, again, I'm thinking now about the ones that talk about the urban issues, but the one that I have, that I refer to as Coming Events Cast Their Shadow, 1939, that's the one that I always go back to because it is so eloquent. Sadie Alexander was an economic historian, and you see that throughout her writings, but you especially see it in that particular writing where she draws on European history and Latin American history and the history of the United States. And she sounds the alarm against events that she saw that were taking place in the United States that she compared to events that were taking place in Germany when she and her husband went there in the early 1930s. And so she was very much concerned about the rise of fascism in the United States, the open expression of hostility against Jews and African Americans in the United States. And so when I read that one, it is eloquent, beautiful, and it speaks to these issues of the rights of all workers and the rights of humans, to dignity and to jobs. But again, it sounds the alarm on the tendency for people to manipulate the economic insecurities that people have through racial demagoguery. And so for me, that speech is not just eloquent, but it's also prescient, and it speaks to these issues of the rise of right-wing populism that we've been thinking about over the last 4 years, the demonization of migrant communities, the tendency for fascism to develop. So that's always the speech that I think means the most to me.
So this is probably a good time to open up for questions. If the audience has any questions for Nina, one of the questions we've got, Nina, is the book available for pre-order? And I've responded that when it is available, that you'll share it with the NEA. So we'll, make it a point to figure out how we can get it distributed, information both via Twitter, potentially on the NEA's website, and also on the NEA listserv. So if there are questions for Nina about either the archival process or a particular question that you have about Dr. Alexander, here is the time. You can ask your question. Don't be shy.
Well, Rhonda, while we're waiting, do you have additional questions that you want to ask?
I think for me, one of the things that that has been, I think, heavily on my mind more recently as there's been more conversation, and we talked a little bit about this earlier, as there's been more conversation about Black women in the economics profession, how we perceive how we perceive ourselves. Okay, I didn't say that right. Not how we perceive ourselves, but how the profession treats and perceives us. And I know that you and I have had these conversations about, and you've alluded to this a little bit. So you said, hey, it is a false narrative to assume that Sadie was not an economist. But I often wonder if she had been allowed to practice and allowed, if she had been hired as an economist, especially at the collegiate level. It just makes me wonder how different our experiences in the profession, in particular as Black women, but also as Black people, like how that might have differed. And this, this is not a question, but this is sort of like, what do you think about that? Do you think that the fact that she was not hired as an economist has had an influence on how the profession treats and perceives Black women who are economists?
No, I don't. And I say that because so she had worked as an academic. So the white women who were early economists were working at women's colleges, right? And black PhD holders typically were working at HBCUs. And so, if we're thinking back to the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, right, prior to the Civil Rights Movement, African American scholars are operating in an environment of racial segregation, and so non-Black scholars overlooked their critical thought because they're operating in segregated environments, and also because they disregarded the thinking of African Americans. So there's been some change in the post-civil rights era. But if we look at the discipline of economics has been very resistant to the critical thinking of Black economists, right? We have a discipline that I think is more likely to be open to the thinking of Black economists who pathologize African Americans, right? Who take that point of view in terms of explaining racial disparities, and tends to overlook or dismiss, not engage with the writings and the publications of African American economists today, even though we're not, operating so much in a racially segregated environment as Sadie Alexander did. So, to be honest, no, I don't think that it would have made a difference. And I also, and this might be controversial, but given what I know about her life and the contributions that she made, I'm okay with her practicing economics the way that she did outside of the academy. And I think that there are really important contributions that scholars make when they engage the community the way that Sadie Alexander did in terms of popularizing economic knowledge. And then, of course, there's her civil rights contributions. So I don't take the standpoint that it would have made a difference.
Okay, I don't know that I disagree with you, but I just figured since so much of the conversation has been about how they treat, how we're treated, it's always on my mind, like how different would it have been had her experience been
okay, so what I want to say, Rhonda, is that this is evidence-based research. It is qualitative. And, within the ranking of our discipline, qualitative research ranks low. And I think that there is an assumption that it is not as rigorous as quantitative research, but it is evidence-based research. And so I'm very careful when I talk about Sadie Alexander. And so when I make claims about her, I make sure that I have evidence to back it up. So the claim in terms of Sadie Alexander being an early proponent of federal job guarantees, right? This is evidence-based research. And so I think that it's problematic when I read narratives about Sadie Alexander that are not based on evidence. That, I think, is troubling, right? So you talk about different narratives. There are lots of narratives out there about Sadie Alexander, but they are absolutely not consistent with historical evidence.
And I know you and I have had this conversation about whether or not she was, her work focused on, and for folks, when you get the speeches, right, and you get the book and you read it, it is one of those that you really, when you're talking about context, because it is the Negro, right? It was the Negro woman, that she didn't focus on just women, but that her concern was for the larger African-American community. And so that's, you and I chatted about how that's one of the narratives that's out there that's not necessarily true, that she wasn't just about women, she was about the livelihood and the experiences of African Americans as a whole.
Okay, and that is really significant because we're talking about a woman, right? And see, again, you know, integrity and the need to be able to get the story straight, because Sadie Alexander is not here to speak for herself. And so if you look at her speeches and, the huge collection of her writings, professional correspondence, personal correspondence, business meetings, what is very clear is that Sadie Alexander focused on African Americans. And that was her priority. And when I say African Americans, I'm talking about, and she was talking about, people who are the descendants of people who were enslaved within the United States. Her priority was to enable African Americans to be able to enjoy the rights of citizenship that white Americans were able to enjoy. That was her population, African American women. And when she talked about African American women, she focused on it in terms of political agency, but she primarily focused on African American women who were domestic workers and the problems that they confronted within the workplace. But most of her speeches are focused on the wide community of African American women and men. In fact, I would say that more of it is dedicated to African American men than African American women, right? Because she was looking at systemic oppression against African Americans. She did not highlight one particular group over another, and again, talking about people who were the descendants of people who were enslaved in the United States. That was her priority, always. That's why she went to law school, in order to help open up opportunities for African Americans.
Okay.
That's a really big issue.
I know, because we've had these conversations, but not for you and I to continue our chat. I want to read you some of the questions that we've got. So the first one is, you're not going to need to write this one down, but this one is really great. So Eddie Gray said, did you at any point involve your sons in your research?
Did I involve them in my research? No. I mean, but they've heard me, like, practicing talks or, talking about her. And so, in the last couple of years, whenever I say something to them about her, they say, well, yeah, Mom, I know that. We know that because we've been listening to you, talk about her over this period of time. So, no, they weren't actively involved, but they were always involved, because when I would come home, I would go back, I'd leave the archives around 4:15. I'd race back to the hotel, and then I would spend the evenings continuing to do research, preparing for a conference or whatever, and sometimes reading things out loud. From being with me at conferences that I read stuff out loud several times. So they know a lot about Sadie Alexander, but no, they were never involved in any research. And in fact, this summer, when I was really pressed for time, and I ended up, I needed to hire, out of my money, a research assistant. For a moment, I thought about hiring my son, my college student son, and I thought, no, I don't have the time to bring him up to speed, and so I hired Lily Shorney, my research assistant, during the summer. So no, they have not been involved in actual research.
So David Mitch asked, did Sadie Alexander have any students or young people that she mentored?
Yes. Did she mentor?
Correct. So, are you finding any young people that that she mentored? Is there any, yeah.
So, and these are the kinds of things that I would talk about in the biography. They were supposed to come out at the same time, but the biography has been delayed because of the COVID shutdown. So there's a person named Warren Banner that I had not heard of before until I was digging through the files. And Warren Banner was an economist, and Sadie Alexander had this great relationship with him, a nurturing, a mentoring type of relationship, right? So there's this really fascinating history about the way in which she worked to secure scholarships for African Americans to go to colleges and to go to graduate schools. She did this through the Urban League and a Quaker society in Philadelphia. And Warren Banner stands out as someone that she really mentored. And then later on, he's a practicing economist. She relies on him for some economic data. So, yeah, Warren Banner would be a good example.
So Christine Negro asked, what are some of the most important economic thinking that you uncovered from Sadie Alexander?
The most important economic thinking. There's this book coming out. There's just so much, right? There's so the book, if you want me to, in terms of the edited volume of her speeches, right, I break that down into 4 themes, if that's helpful. The first theme focuses on Sadie Alexander's challenges to racial ideology, right, racist beliefs about African Americans. And so she challenges them through by documenting the contributions to African Americans to our economy and our culture and our political system, right? So that's one theme. Another theme would be, the role of Black women in the political economy, because she's within a political economy tradition. And so that goes to issues of voting and leadership, but it also focuses on the status of African American women who are the marginal workers and who are not protected as workers. So their exclusion from New Deal benefits, right? So there's the issue, and I talked about some of this in the speech. There's the issue of the need for race-conscious policies, for example. The next section focuses on Black workers and economic justice, right? And so that gets into issues about full employment, job guarantees, livable wages, a whole host of, the role of Blacks in labor unions, right, a whole host of issues, the persistence of labor market discrimination against Black workers and the persistence of high levels of unemployment. And then the last section, which is the biggest section, is democracy and citizenship rights. I think that's what I titled it. And that's, these big issues about, the need for economic rights to underpin democratic rights, and the threat to the rule of law, and again, she draws on her knowledge of economic history and events in our history in terms of racial violence to craft out these arguments. And that goes to the rise of right-wing populism and urban rebellions against these unjust living conditions tied to disinvestment in Black communities, substandard housing, insufficient school funding, over-policing, police brutality, all the things that we're talking about today. So I got a book on it.
Including white privilege, right? That was the speech at Spelman College, which when I read that, I was like, oh, this is the conversation we have now about white privilege, right? There's a speech in which she's talking about in particular, wealthy white men and what they have access to?
Always, right? So that's a persistent theme of this, right? You know, one of the reasons why I've spent all these years, you know, digging through these archives is that she was fierce. She was a fierce critic of white supremacy, right? Or, you know, in, you know, the way that we talk about today in terms of, you know, anti-blackness, right? A critique, you know, she gave us a critique of you know, these forces of anti-blackness. You know, she didn't hold any punches. Ever, right? So she always called things out as she saw them. It's amazing. She was very modern in all kinds of ways. And again, this is something that comes out in the biography, you know, and you know, her modern way of thinking and also her modern way of speaking on some issues. And I think that, you know, with the volume, it's going to appeal to not only economists, but also to people in political theory, historians, especially you know, historians of African American, you know, the African American experience and African American women in particular. But a few years ago, somebody who teaches a course on rhetoric contacted me to say that she used the Black Worker article on in her class. So lots of things.
Yeah, I thought that as well when I was like, oh wow, that she was definitely very direct and put like, wow, I don't know. And I was reading something and I was like, good gracious, she was stepping on some toes and she was stepping hard with some of the things that she said. I was like, what in the world?
Yeah,
okay,
yeah.
So we've got about 10 more minutes and a couple more questions. So,
okay, because sometimes I would laugh out loud at the things that she said. Like I said, it was always exhilarating doing this research. Sometimes my mouth would, you know, my jaw would drop because I was like, wow, did she really say that?
Yep, and the answer is yes, she did.
Oh, and I'm not talking about the speeches. I'm talking about stuff that I found in the archives as well.
Oh, okay. So like personal letters to other folks is what you're referencing?
Correspondence, business correspondence especially.
Okay, so Marcel has another question, and he says, did you meet resistance in bringing up Sadie as a topic for economic historians to be included? Like, did you get pushback with reference to that?
I'm not sure I understand the question. What I will say is that I had a great deal of difficulty publishing on Sadie Alexander after a while. So I had 2 articles, and I have 3 that were, you know, working papers. One was a chapter. The author decided not to publish the book, and the 2 others were manuscripts that I sent to journals. And one of the journal, you know, sent me back comments from one reviewer, and I sent it to it, and they were always, you know, the comments were revised and resubmit, but it wasn't sufficient, right? Since it was just one, and so I gave it to somebody else to read, who said, you know, you've really got 3 speeches, you know, you've got 3 papers in here, right? And then with the other journal, the comments that I got were, I thought, problematic. With one person, you know, and they were all, you know, snippy types of comments. Like one person said, you didn't quote Nina Banks enough, or, you know, I don't like the use of the word empowerment that you were using to describe her. But the one that really got it for me was somebody who said, and this is a journal that publishes research on early women economists. One person said, well, you know, Sadie Alexander was a public intellectual. What I think is that you should submit this to a different journal, one that focuses on public intellectuals. And I found that really troubling because, to me, what that said is that because Sadie Alexander faced racial oppression, right, in addition to gender-based oppression, racial oppression, her experience was different from that of white women economists. And so if the journal could include white women economists who were dealing with, you know, gender-based oppression, why didn't it also have room for a black woman, right? So I had resistance from journals and, you know, decided to give speeches and do podcasts and things of that nature, knowing that I was going to be writing books on Sadie Alexander, the edited volume and the biography. So that was okay, and, you know, there's silver lining in that, because it means that what it meant is that I already had some manuscripts that I had written that I could then, draw from in order to construct introductions to the edited volume.
Okay,
I don't know if that answers the question or not.
I think so. I think that I got the gist of it was, even though it was for maybe in the economic historian space, if folks were resistant, I think your response.
Well, so because it wouldn't be in an economic history space. This is more history of economic thought. It's a combination of economic history, but I think the real space would be intellectual history, history of economic thought. And as we know, that unfortunately, this is a discipline where there is not much of an emphasis on that. And so most economists are no longer trained in history of economic thought. And so it's difficult then to find readers who not only have a background in history of economic thought, but also know African-American history and African-American women's history. It has been very difficult to find people who I think are sufficiently knowledgeable to be able to give, to be able to review this within economics. What does that say about our discipline, right? Lack of emphasis on economic history, lack of emphasis, the lack of interest or writing about the history of African-American women and work, history of thought. Those fields are no longer very prominent in our discipline.
Okay, so I'm going to put these two questions together, and hopefully I will do this well. So one is, as you were reading her speeches, did you see her identify as a feminist? And then as you were, looking over her speeches over time, did you see a change in thought? Right? Did you see the economic influences of her law degree on her thoughts on issues in economics over time? Right? Like, yeah. Those are it's two questions I'm trying to put together. One, let me ask them separately. Did she identify as a feminist?
No. Okay. She never said I'm a feminist, if that's the question. No. But that's true of most of our early feminist thinkers, is that, we go back and we review their writings and their actions to see if they are consistent with our understanding of feminism, right? Which I define as in terms of intersectional feminism. It's a theory of liberation of all people. And we look at that through the lens of gender, but it's about liberation of all people. And so her writings and her actions are consistent. But no, she did not self-identify in anything that I've read as a feminist. And in fact, like all of us, she was complex and contradictory. And so there are things that you could point to and say, that's really not very feminist thinking. But if we look at the body of her work, it's very much consistent with a feminist worldview. And then your second question, I think, was about, did I see evidence of her combining her legal expertise with her economic analysis? Yes. There are many cases where she combined her legal expertise with her economic analysis, and there are places in the book where I point that out, and there are many of other places where I don't point it out, but I think that it's also certainly embedded within the logic of her analysis.
Okay, and then the last question I believe that I'll ask you is, and let me first acknowledge that Sindele had the question about feminists, that she was a feminist, and Arthur's question was the question about the influence of economics and law in her writing. And then Yana wants to know if it was worth it, would you do it again?
Would I do all this again? Yeah, yes. I would, right? And again, this was not a good career move, right? Because it took me long time to do it. I had a hard time publishing. I did this for Sadie Alexander, and I did it for African Americans, for African American history. And so, yeah, I think I would do it again, because what I found is that Sadie Alexander not only continued to function, right, as an economist, and continue to think of herself as an economist. So there's the restoration of her intellectual thought. But what I found is that she made significant contributions to our history in terms of civil rights. And I'm not going to go into that because that's the subject of the biography. But I would absolutely do this again. I mean, this research for me was thrilling. I'm a nerd, right, who likes to be in a dusty archives all day reading through old papers. So it was thrilling, and I would absolutely do it again. And in fact, I wish that after this biography comes out, and it's going to come out in June of 2022, I wish that someone, graduate student, assistant professor, associate professor in econ or history would approach me, because there are lots of different avenues that I would like to direct them in terms of future research tied to Sadie Alexander that I'm too old to continue to do.
Whatever, Nina. So there's a comment that said they were surprised that she didn't donate her papers to an HBCU as opposed to a PWI.
The Alexander family had extensive ties to the University of Pennsylvania, right, in terms of all of these amazing firsts. With her father, who was the first African-American lawyer, right, and Sadie Alexander being the first, African-American, one of those first African-American women to get a doctorate degree and to come out of the program 1921, first African-American woman, and the first African-American woman to graduate from their law school and pass the bar in Pennsylvania. And I got to say, she had a lot of bumpy roads at Penn as an undergraduate. And when she was a law student, she writes about them, and she spoke about them, right? But her time in the economics department, I got to say, they were very supportive. I have not read anything to suggest that her economics professors were anything but supportive in terms of recognizing the importance of her research, the need to find funding for her, to help her, on her job search. So, yeah, and they have done, the University of Pennsylvania Archives has done an amazing job of organizing and maintaining the Alexander files. So, and Philadelphia is her city of birth. It's where she spent her life. So I don't think that is any commentary on HBCUs, but rather it's a commentary about the deep, extensive connections between the Alexander family and the University of Pennsylvania. And I'm deeply grateful to the archival staff for all of the assistance that they have provided me over these many years of research.
Okay, so thank you for that. And I'm going to encourage Vincent Cobb, who was killing me in the chat, because Vince is like, look, UPenn didn't promote a career. They should have known that she was going to run into this. And that's, that's not really I think that if you're on the outside and you haven't spent work then you haven't spent time in the archives, what you feel is here was an institution, especially as we think about the job market now, so much of the opportunities that you get are based on part of what you do, your topic, but also based on what your committee does for you in terms of we're about at a time.
So okay, let me just address that because I think it's important. Her faculty tried to help her get a job, right? And I think, and for people who are young and want to do archival research, there's a real danger in using today's standards to evaluate or to project onto the past. And so the way that people get jobs today at a university is different from how people got jobs in 1921, right? That's one thing to think about. She confronted systemic discrimination in finding and trying to get a job, and that also includes from HBCUs, right, and women's college, right? So that's not on her department. Her economics department tried to help her get a job. She was up against something bigger, which is systemic oppression against African American women. If that helps to explain what you're talking about, right? Today, departments get together and decide, okay, we want to hire a behavioral economist, and it gets approved, and they do a search. That didn't happen in 1921. A university president might decide, okay, I'm going to hire her because, of whatever reason, or I will hire him. And so when the first African American women who got their doctorate degrees were hired at the doctorate level, when they were hired at a level that was commensurate with their doctorate degrees, that was 1929, when Howard hired Eva Dykes as into their English department as a professor. But before that, she was working as a high school teacher at Dunbar School. M Street was renamed as Dunbar. Georgiana Simpson was also working as a high school teacher. So all three of them confronted systemic discrimination against African American women.
Okay, so thank you for that. So we're a little bit over time. So there was a question about your next project, right? Do you have more projects? And so you mentioned you've got the biography, and of course we need to finish our book, right? So Bruce, yes, she has other projects.
I have a lot, right? That's why I'm saying I need to pass on after the biography, right? There are still some projects tied to Sadie Alexander that I want to wrap up, and then I have our book, our edited volume, and then there's another book contract that I signed years ago with University of Toronto Press that deals with women of color and unpaid collective work. So, yeah, a lot of projects on the horizon.
Okay, so National Economic Association President-elect Nina Banks, my travel buddy. For those of you who are still around, I want to take this as an opportunity, again, to thank the National Economic Association for allowing Nina and I an opportunity to have this conversation in broader space, because we often have these conversations just one-on-one. And I also want to say that for me, one of the things that I really am appreciative of this conversation is it highlights the ways in which Black women are supportive of each other. And I know for me it is always nice to be able to talk to either, Nina, and you all saw that in the chat. Then Nina was giving the name of Leah Bustan when I was like, I know she's somewhere in UCLA or Princeton. But I also want to encourage you that if you're not a member of the National Economic Association, to join, right? This is an organization that, since I think I came to my very first ASSA meeting in 1995, has always been supportive. And if you look at my 50th anniversary clip, I talk about how the NEA has always been Team Rhonda. It has given me an opportunity to get to know broadly senior economists, but in particular senior women like Margaret Sims, Julianne Malveaux. I'm going to be writing a piece to highlight more women, and Wilene Johnson, who is my I want to say my local ride or die female economist down the road from me here in Virginia. So Nina, I want to thank you for the time to share your labor of love. I really applaud your ability in that 10-year stretch to continue to actually do this work, because I think for many of us, we would have just been like, it would have been a dust pile sitting on the shelf. So thank you, and thank you, National Economics Association, for giving us this opportunity. Please check the website in the upcoming weeks for snippets from this and to see the schedule that Nina has put together for the ASSA meetings that will really kick off celebrating 100 years of Black economics. And Nina, I'm going to leave the last words to you.
Thank you all for joining us. We are well over time, and so I appreciate your patience. Thank you very much. And thank you, Weiser, and thank you, NEA, for co-sponsoring this event.
Okay. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you, Rhonda. Have a great day.
See you later.